Responsibility to Protect, or RTP, was established by the Canadian government under the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty. RTP argues that the international community should be responsible to protect populations who are suffering in states where the state fails to do so. The moral component of RTP attempted to reorient the way people perceive conflict. Instead of focusing on the rights of the state and importance of state sovereignty, the focus became the need to protect humans as individuals. Did RTP establish a universality to human rights? Based on states' limited reactions to a number of events that can be classified as atrocities, it is not likely that human rights will become a key importance for political decision-makers. The international system is ruled by geopolitical strategy, and RTP is subjected to the whims of the United Nations Security Council, who make the ultimate decision of whether or not to intervene. Governments make decisions based on self-interest, and are unlikely to impose RTP if doing so has detrimental effects for their state. For example, even though the conflict in Syria is widely perceived as a human atrocity, China and Russia have vetoed an intervention based on RTP. Nearly 3 million people have fled Syria to escape the civil war, and approximately 250,000 people have been killed. Not only is it a civil war between those who support and oppose President Assad, but there is also the rising Islamic State who is trying to gain power throughout the chaos. Furthermore, the UN Commission of Inquiry has confirmed that both sides of the conflict have committed war crimes, including blocking civilian access to food, health services, and water as a method of war, and also the use of chemical weaponry. Yet, Russia has blocked all resolutions proposed to the Security Council that would interfere with Assad's regime, and also backs Assad with military aid. The reason for this being that Russia has interests in Syria, mainly Russia's only Mediterranean naval base. Thus, human rights are really not universal if they can be guaranteed or ignored by more powerful governments. It is also argued that the responsibility to protect is just as disguised for neocolonialism and neo-imperialism. Since states are so unwilling to intervene in another nation's conflict, R2P has been reworked to focus on preventing mass atrocities. Western states often compare conflict-ridden civilizations to their own model of governing, and attempt to establish a democratic structure to create peace and stability in these nations. When the UN was trying to restore peace to East Timor in the 1999 referendum crisis, the UN mission focused on building a democracy with liberal institutions, assuming that the dominant Western model would be most effective. However, the failure to understand the culture and work with local communities created a negative reaction from the population who placed importance on the idea of sovereignty, especially as a post-colonial state. Thus, many post-colonial nations see R2P as a new imperialistic tactic of the West to gain influence and power in their states. The next problem associated with R2P is determining which state is to be responsible to provide troops and carry out the intervention. The US, as the current hegemonic power, feels that a majority of the responsibility falls onto their state because they are the most able to lend military assistance. The US government resents this fact and doesn't want to be obligated to help other nations if it is not in the best interest of the state. This was true during the Rwandan genocide, where the US was simply not interested in getting involved in another African conflict after the casualties suffered in Somalia. 1 million people were killed in the Rwandan conflict, and only years later did the UN apologize for failing to provide sufficient assistance and recognize the crisis as a genocide. Since Western states are often assumed the nations to be responsible to uphold R2P, who will stop atrocities from happening in the West? Looking at the Canadian mistreatment of Native Americans, for example, where the residential school system that Native children were forced to attend was a cultural genocide, yet no state tried to intervene in Canada or bring attention to the inhumanity of government actions. This raises the question, are states uncomfortable in judging Western and Northern nations, and is the entire R2P system regulated by Western superiority? It would seem that because the more developed and stable Western and Northern states are the most capable of carrying out interventions, and more inclined to pursue conflicts that fall outside their democratic civilizations, the R2P is controlled by such nations.